Greek controllers repeatedly tried to contact the flight, but received only silence. The aircraft reached Athens, where it would typically begin its descent, but it didn't. Instead, it started to circle in a holding pattern over the island of Kea, some 65 kilometers southeast of Athens. With no communication from the aircraft and growing concerns about the situation on board, the Greek military decided to intervene, possibly suspecting a terrorism incident. At 11:23 in the morning, while Flight 522 began its sixth loop in the holding pattern, two F-16s finally reached the aircraft. One of the F-16s took a position behind the aircraft, ready to fire, while the other drew in for a closer look. But what they saw next was beyond anything they could have imagined. Join us as we delve into the story of Helios Airways Flight 522. On the evening of August 13, 2005, a Boeing 737 operated by Helios Airways departed from London Heathrow, heading toward Larnaca, a port city on the south coast of Cyprus. The flight progressed smoothly until the cabin crew detected an unusual noise. A loud banging sound was coming from the right aft service door. Upon closer inspection, they found that the seal around the door had frozen, raising concerns about the integrity of the aircraft's pressurization system. After landing in Larnaca at 1:25 in the morning, the flight crew documented the issue in the aircraft cabin defect log. They noted that the right aft service door required a full inspection. Additionally, the captain personally communicated the problem to the ground engineer, Alan Irwin. Alan Irwin, an experienced engineer, conducted a visual inspection and pressurization leak check to identify potential faults. To perform the leak check while the aircraft was still on the ground, it had to be manually pressurized. The pressurization system on a Boeing 737 is crucial for maintaining a safe and comfortable cabin pressure. It simulates lower altitude conditions to ensure passengers and crew have adequate oxygen levels during the flight. This system operates automatically in flight, adjusting as the aircraft changes altitude. During the ground tests and maintenance checks, the pressurization system was set to manual mode. This setting allowed Alan to control the pressurization process directly, enabling him to test for leaks and ensure the integrity of the cabin's pressure seals without the aircraft's engines running. The inspection revealed no defects, the pressurization system appeared to function correctly, and no abnormal noises were detected. Satisfied with the results, Alan concluded his inspection and cleared the aircraft for service. However, a critical detail was overlooked. The pressurization mode selector remained in the manual position, setting the stage for unforeseen events. The following morning, on August 14, 2005, the same Boeing 737 was prepared for its next journey. Two pilots and four cabin crew arrived at the aircraft to operate Flight 522 to Prague, with a stopover in Athens. The flight plan for that day was to fly northwest over the Mediterranean Sea toward the Greek mainland and descend into Athens for a scheduled stopover. After departing Athens, the aircraft would head north, crossing southeastern Europe before finally reaching its destination in Prague. In command was 58-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, an experienced pilot. He had worked with various small airlines across Europe and had since accumulated a respectable number of hours on the Boeing 737. Although his reserved attitude sometimes did not sit well with Cypriot flight crews, there had been no serious complaints about his performance since he started at Helios Airways earlier in 2005. His co-pilot that day was 51-year-old First Officer Pambos Karalambis, a citizen of Cyprus. He was also experienced on the Boeing 737 and had been flying for Helios Airways since shortly after its founding. As 115 passengers, mostly Cypriots and Greeks, boarded for the first leg to Athens, the pilots started their pre-flight checks. These included approximately 80 items, 8 of which involved switches on the pressurization panel. One of these items was the pressurization mode selector, which should be set to auto. These checks proceeded as usual, but the crew failed to notice that the pressurization mode selector was still set to manual, the setting used during the maintenance checks the previous day. After completing their pre-flight checks, the pilots moved on to the before-start checklist, verifying that all aircraft systems were configured correctly for flight. Despite this thorough process, the pressurization mode selector set to manual still went unnoticed, a critical oversight that had serious consequences. With all checks completed, the pilot started the engines, pushed back from the gate, and taxied to the runway. After an uneventful takeoff roll, the aircraft became airborne a little after 9 o'clock in the morning, climbing toward 10,000 feet, with further clearances expected to follow. The aircraft climbed steadily at about 2,500 feet per minute for the next 5 minutes as the controller cleared Flight 522 to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet, with the cabin pressure equalizing with the outside air pressure almost as fast. No one realized that a serious problem was unfolding. Before we continue with the unfolding mystery, I'd like to thank our sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, now free on PC and consoles. Take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, spanning from the 1920s to today. Immerse yourself in intense combat with incredibly detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound. Join over 70 million players worldwide in epic PvP battles and explore the vast, high-quality content War Thunder offers. It's perfect for fans of military history. What I personally love is the variety of vehicles you can control and the level of detail in each battle. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox now using the link in the pinned comment or video description. New and returning players who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack, including premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. This offer is limited, so act fast. The events of Flight 522. At 9:12 in the morning, as the aircraft climbed through 12,500 feet, the air pressure inside the cabin reached the equivalent of 10,000 feet, automatically triggering the cabin altitude warning horn. Normally, the maximum cabin pressure is approximately 8,000 feet above sea level during flight. This ensures passenger comfort and safety throughout the journey. The cabin altitude warning horn should have alerted the crew to halt the ascent, don their oxygen masks, and then descend to a lower altitude. Unfortunately, the crew mistook this critical warning for a takeoff configuration alert. On the Boeing 737, the takeoff configuration warning horn sounds the same as the cabin altitude warning. However, the takeoff configuration warning can only be heard on the ground when the pilots advance the thrust levers without correctly configuring the aircraft for flight. This led to confusion, and as a result, the critical procedure of donning oxygen masks and descending was not followed. Unaware of their mistake, the situation in the cockpit intensified. A few minutes later, both equipment cooling warning lights, labeled with the word OFF, illuminated. This indicated low airflow through the cooling fans due to the decreased air density. The master caution light also activated, signaling that the situation required immediate attention. Climbing through 16,000 feet, Captain Merton contacted Helios Airways dispatch for help. He explained that a takeoff configuration warning horn was sounding and that there was an issue with the equipment cooling system. This problem was beyond the dispatcher's expertise, so he added Alan Irwin, the same maintenance engineer who conducted the pressure test, over the radio. Merton told Irwin that both his equipment cooling lights were off. Unfortunately, Merton's relatively limited knowledge of English caused confusion. He likely meant to say, "Both my equipment cooling OFF lights are on," but what came out was something altogether different. Confused by Merton's concern about a warning light being off, Irwin responded, "This is normal," and then asked Merton to clarify the problem. The captain's response, however, wasn't very illuminating. "They are not switched off," he said. As the conversation continued, the cabin altitude rose past 14,000 feet, causing the passenger oxygen masks to deploy automatically. An indication labeled "Pass Oxy On" lit up on the overhead panel, but it went unnoticed by the crew. Normally, this alert would have triggered the master caution light to draw attention, but since it was already active, it failed to catch the pilot's eye. Unbeknownst to the pilots, hypoxia, a silent killer, was slowly impairing their judgment. Hypoxia severely impairs cognitive and physical functions, which is especially critical for pilots who need to maintain high levels of alertness and decision-making capabilities. They should have quickly descended to a lower altitude where the air pressure was sufficient for normal breathing. Ideally below 10,000 feet, however, they did not take this action. While passengers and flight attendants began using their oxygen masks, the pilots remained focused on the equipment cooling system. Suspecting that Merton might have been looking at the green manual light on the pressurization panel next to the equipment cooling panel, Irwin asked if he could confirm that the pressurization mode selector was set to auto. However, the captain, already experiencing the initial symptoms of hypoxia, disregarded this question and instead asked where his equipment cooling circuit breakers were. As altitude increased, negative effects accumulated due to decreasing blood oxygen content. By the time the conversation with dispatch ended, Flight 522 was approaching 29,000 feet above sea level, with a cabin altitude between 24,000 and 26,000 feet. Mountaineers refer to anything above 26,000 feet as the death zone, where the human body cannot absorb sufficient oxygen, leading to the deterioration of physical and mental faculties, eventually resulting in death. Unfortunately, Captain Merton and the first officer never donned their oxygen masks and never realized that their aircraft had not been pressurized. The cabin altitude approached the death zone when Captain Merton got out of his chair to find the circuit breakers but collapsed from lack of oxygen. First Officer Carolambus fell unconscious around the same time, still strapped into his seat. Passengers and flight attendants who put on their oxygen masks managed to stay conscious a bit longer. Still, these masks only provided about 12 minutes of oxygen, assuming the pilots would descend to a lower altitude where normal breathing was possible. Instead, Flight 522 continued to climb on autopilot until it leveled off at approximately 34,000 feet between 9:30 and 9:40. Air traffic control repeatedly attempted to contact the aircraft but received no response. Meanwhile, Helios Flight 522, guided by autopilot, followed its normal route into Greek airspace. Greek controllers repeatedly tried to contact the flight but received only silence. The aircraft reached Athens, where it would typically begin its descent. However, since the autopilot required manual input to initiate descent, the aircraft did not descend. Instead, it started to circle in a holding pattern over the island of Kea, some 65 kilometers southeast of Athens. A holding pattern is a predetermined maneuver that keeps an aircraft within a specified airspace while awaiting further instructions from air traffic control. It typically involves flying in a circular pattern, ensuring the aircraft stays in a manageable area and altitude, conserving fuel, and avoiding other air traffic. With no communication from the aircraft and growing concerns about the situation on board, the Greek military decided to intervene, possibly suspecting a terrorism incident. At around 11 a.m., two F-16 fighter jets scrambled from NEA Anchialos airbase to establish visual contact with the passenger jet. The Boeing 737 remained in its holding pattern, guided by the autopilot, and at 23 minutes past 11 o'clock in the morning, while Flight 522 began its sixth loop in the holding pattern, the two F-16s finally reached the aircraft. The F-16 pilots likely had no idea what to expect, as the situation was already highly unusual, unlike anything they or the controllers had encountered before. But things were about to get even stranger, as one of the F-16s took a position behind the aircraft, ready to fire, while the other drew in for a closer look. Approaching the aircraft, the pilot of the F-16 attempted to signal their presence to the crew, but the crew of the 737 did not react. They checked the exterior for damage but saw none. As one of the F-16s moved closer, the pilot came upon a scene straight out of a horror movie. The cabin lights were off, and oxygen masks hung down in the aisles, illuminated by sunlight coming through the windows. Several passengers wearing oxygen masks were slumped against the windows, completely motionless. Positioning his jet closer to the cockpit, the F-16 pilot spotted a person slumped in the first officer's seat, showing no signs of life, while the captain's seat was empty. Shocked by this sight, the F-16 pilot realized that Flight 522 had become a ghost flight, with its passengers and crew seemingly unconscious or dead. For another 14 minutes, the 737 continued to fly in circles, shadowed by the two F-16s, whose pilots seemed condemned to wait for the inevitable. Then, something unbelievable happened. Someone entered the cockpit. With a mask covering his face and a bottle beside him, he settled into the captain's seat and gripped the controls. At this point, Flight 522 was in its 10th holding pattern, and its fuel reserves were almost depleted. The unidentified pilot had little time to get used to the 737 cockpit because the left engine flamed out less than a minute after he entered the flight deck. With only one engine providing thrust, the aircraft turned sharply to the left before stabilizing on a northwesterly course. Unable to maintain altitude at 34,000 feet with only one engine, it began to descend. Although the man attempted to control the aircraft, he did not succeed. Despite this, the fighter pilots could not get his attention, and they were forced to back off to reduce the risk of a mid-air collision. Within minutes, the 737 crossed over the island of Euboea, descending rapidly. One of the F-16s drew close again and saw the first officer sitting upright, as though the man had tried to wake him, but he remained motionless. Shortly after, the aircraft turned sharply to the left, crossing over the island again. Approaching 7,000 feet and descending at several thousand feet per minute, Flight 522 was moments away from disaster when its right engine also ran out of fuel and flamed out. At that moment, the man acknowledged the fighter for the first time, responding to a hand signal. The fighter pilot then signaled for the mystery pilot to follow him to the airport, but the man simply pointed down, indicating that the aircraft was going down and there was nothing he could do. Crossing back onto mainland Greece, the aircraft turned sharply to the left again, ascending toward the hills lining the coast northeast of Athens. Recognizing that a crash was imminent, the F-16s pulled away. At the last moment, the man at the controls attempted to pull up just before impact, perhaps hoping to ease the aircraft into the ground, but his efforts were fruitless. At 3:12 in the afternoon, Helios Flight 522 impacted hard and burst into flames. Seconds later, the F-16 pilots radioed it in, Helios Flight 522 was down. Tragically, all 121 people on board lost their lives in this incident. Fire crews and ambulances, already alerted to the ongoing emergency, immediately rushed to the scene of the crash on Grammatiko Hill, just outside the village of Grammatiko, some 35 kilometers northeast of Athens. The investigation. The crash of Helios Airways Flight 522 was the result of a series of errors and systemic failures. Mechanic Alan Irwin claimed he had reset the pressurization mode selector to auto after maintenance, but this was found to be untrue after extensive investigation. Despite his denials, Irwin was charged with 121 counts of manslaughter, which devastated his life. Although he was eventually acquitted, the damage was irreversible. Initially, there was doubt because the switch was found turned past manual, suggesting it may have been wrenched during impact. However, data from the electronic pressure control system confirmed the outflow valve was fully open from takeoff, preventing cabin pressurization. The data also revealed ongoing pressurization issues in the last 74 flights stored in the system's memory. These flights had experienced excessive leakage, consistent with crew reports of problems with the R2 door. Several opportunities to prevent the crash were missed. Routine checks before takeoff of the pressurization settings could have identified that the pressurization mode selector was in the manual instead of the auto position. Additionally, after takeoff, the cabin altitude warning horn was triggered, indicating a dangerous lack of cabin pressure. However, the pilots mistook this warning for a different alarm and failed to take corrective action. As a result, they gradually lost consciousness due to hypoxia and never recovered. Flight attendant Andreas, who had a private pilot's license, managed to enter the cockpit later in the flight. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to save the aircraft due to his limited experience and the critical situation. By the time he gained access to the cockpit, the aircraft had already run out of fuel, and it was too late to prevent the crash. In their final report, investigators made several recommendations to prevent such accidents in the future. One key recommendation was that Boeing update the 737 maintenance manual to ensure the pressurization mode selector is returned to auto after a pressurization test, as well as installing 2 additional warning lights in the cockpit, one for takeoff configuration and one for the cabin altitude warning. This tragedy underscores the vital need for a robust safety culture and unwavering adherence to established protocols. Implementing these lessons and stringent safety measures is essential to prevent such disasters from occurring again. Again, thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe my channel and like to my video.